A major update in the Nolan Wells case, the new timeline, plus the unnamed witnesses now exposed.
There's been a lot of people that have been contacted and interviewed, and there's a lot of people who were there that day that voluntarily came forward to tell what they know.
This report goes a long way in identifying, who may be a witness to those critical hours and minutes that there are gaps of information.
A witness may be out there right now who has never been asked a single question about the day Nolan Wells disappeared. That's not speculation. It's the conclusion of a 22-page report released this week, built entirely from photos and videos that ordinary people sent in after a volunteer search group made one simple request. If you were on Horn Island on July 4th, come forward. What came back exposed something nobody investigating this case has said publicly. A 64-minute window that afternoon nobody can fully account for. And the one fact everyone's repeated for weeks like it was settled, the exact minute the boat left the island without Nolan, was never actually confirmed by anything except someone's memory. Buried inside that report is a photograph. A cluster of boats, tied together, packed with people, anchored in the exact water where Nolan was last seen alive. Most of them have never been identified. And there's something else in that same report that's gotten almost no attention. A boat that moved position between two photographs, lining up almost exactly with the timing of a video everyone's already seen, and that nobody has actually been able to verify. By the end of this video, you'll understand precisely what that report found, why 64 minutes has become the most contested stretch of time in this entire case, and why the group that built it says the real story isn't in these 22 pages. It's who still hasn't been asked. If you're new to this channel, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're covering this case in real time, and there's a lot more in this report to get through. Now, here's how we got here. To understand why that window matters, you have to understand who actually built this report, and why nobody expected them to be the ones filling in the gaps that investigators have left open for a month. The organization is called the United Cajun Navy. Most people who know the name know it from hurricane response, volunteer boat crews who show up when the water rises, and professional resources are stretched thin. They were part of the search that combed Horn Island for 2 days after Nolan disappeared. And weeks later, when the case had gone quiet on the official side, but louder than ever online, they did something search and rescue groups don't usually do. They asked the public directly, if you were on that island on July 4th, and you have a photo, a video, anything, send it in. What came back was more than they expected. Dozens of people responded. Photos, screenshots of videos that had circulated on social media and then vanished. GPS coordinates, timestamps. The group's vice president has been careful about what they're claiming this adds up to. The report isn't meant to point fingers or draw conclusions, he said publicly. It's meant to add whatever might be relevant and to keep the kind of transparency the organization says it's known for. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. This isn't a rival investigation. It's not a group of amateurs trying to solve a case from their living rooms. It's a compilation, 22 pages of exactly what regular people who happened to be in the water that day were willing to hand over, organized into something a district attorney's office, a sheriff's department, and Nolan's own parents could actually read. All three of them already have a copy. Building that compilation wasn't simple. The process started with the pictures themselves, layering them against satellite imagery to figure out precisely where each one was taken, then cross-referencing that against the coordinates broadcast early on by Marine Patrol when the search first began. One boat's position at one moment, the same stretch of water, empty, an hour later. A volunteer analyst who's helped the organization piece together timelines in other cases did much of that comparison work by hand, matching shoreline features and boat silhouettes across dozens of separate images submitted by people who never talked to each other. She's asked not to be named publicly yet, and the organization has respected that. A small, easy-to-miss detail in a case where almost nobody connected to it has been afforded that kind of restraint. Out of that process came a working index. Which images, from which angle, at approximately what time? It took days, not hours, and even then, the report is careful to note that certain conclusions about relative timing rely on visual comparison rather than hard data, an acknowledgement that separates this document from the kind of definitive proof true crime coverage often promises and rarely delivers. Not certainty, an index. And right at the center of that index sits a single photograph, the one that's driving everything else in this report. Page 12 shows 3 boats anchored side by side, one identified only as boat number 3, one called the Palm Beach, and the Triton, the same boat Nolan arrived on that morning. Other images in the report show a wider cluster still, more boats tied together nearby, all given informal labels rather than official identification. Boat 1, Boat 2, Boat X, another called Frontier Bay. Numbers stood in for names because, at the time these images were collected, nobody outside that cluster actually knew who most of these people were. Look closely at those photos, and something else stands out. People aren't just waiting near shore. In several of the images, the water comes up past their waists, and in some cases close to their necks. Horn Island is known for an unusually sharp drop-off close to shore, shallow water giving way to deep water within just a few steps, which means a meaningful number of the people in these photos weren't standing on solid ground. They were treading water, in an area where a single strong current can turn a summer holiday into an emergency in seconds. Investigators reviewing the report have reportedly used details like shadow length and angle to estimate roughly when each image was taken, since the timestamps on most of them can't yet be independently confirmed. It's a reminder of how much painstaking low-tech work sits behind a single line in a report that just says, late afternoon. Here's why that matters beyond the obvious danger. Every person visible in that cluster was close enough, at some point that afternoon, to have seen something. A face, a boat pulling away, Nolan himself. And as of the report's release, there's no public indication that most of them have ever been identified, let alone interviewed. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to think about this case only in terms of the people whose names you already know. Nolan's friends, his family, the handful of witnesses who've given interviews. But Horn Island on the 4th of July isn't a quiet place. It's hundreds of boats, thousands of people, most of them strangers to each other, all sharing the same stretch of water for one holiday afternoon, and then scattering back into their normal lives by nightfall. Somewhere in that crowd, someone was teaching a cousin to wakeboard. Someone else was nursing a sunburn, annoyed at themselves for forgetting sunscreen again. Ordinary holiday noise, all of it, happening less than 100 yards from whatever actually happened to Nolan Wells. None of those people had any reason, in the moment, to memorize what they were seeing. Most of them still don't know they might have. For nearly all of them, July 4th was just a day at the beach, a photo on someone's phone that never got a second look, until a volunteer group asked the internet to go digging. Somewhere in that crowd, entirely by accident, sits whatever version of that afternoon nobody's heard yet. Which brings us to the number at the center of this entire report, 64 minutes. According to the timeline the Cajun Navy assembled, the last independently corroborated sighting of Nolan places him on the island at 3:23 in the afternoon. The boat he arrived on is reported to have left without him at 4:31. Between those 2 points sits a gap of just over an hour, and the report is explicit that this is the single most important stretch of time in the entire case. Not because something is proven to have happened during it, because almost nothing about it has been verified at all. Investigators care about a window like this because a gap this short is narrow enough to actually search, and wide enough that a great deal can happen inside it. Attorneys care because a verified gap like this either supports or unravels a timeline that, right now, is built almost entirely on memory. And families care for the most human reason there is. 64 minutes is close to the last real chance anyone had to notice something was wrong before it was too late to matter. The report doesn't fill that gap. It does something more specific, and in some ways more useful. It lays out exactly what would need to exist to fill it. Original video files, not screenshots, so their timestamps can actually be trusted. Phone location data, boat GPS and engine records, the kind that can confirm a departure time down to the second, instead of relying on someone's memory of what the clock read. And a complete list of who was actually on each boat, cross-checked against what's visible in every photo. None of that exists publicly yet. Which means, 64 minutes in, this case is still standing on witness memory. And memory, even well-intentioned memory, is exactly why the report treats every claim inside it with so much caution. Strip away the analysis, and the entire report ultimately narrows down to 5 specific, answerable questions. What happened in the 64 minutes between the last confirmed sighting and the reported departure? Whether that departure time can be verified electronically rather than remembered. Which boats moved during that window, and where they went. Who was actually aboard each of those boats, matched against what's visible in every photo submitted. And whether the handful of disputed sightings and secondhand claims that have circulated since July 4th can be confirmed, corrected, or ruled out entirely. None of those questions is dramatic on its own. Together, they're a checklist for exactly the kind of unglamorous, document-heavy work that actually closes cases like this one. Work that has nothing to do with theories or motive, and everything to do with GPS logs, cell records, and boat registrations that either exist or don't. The report's authors have said, in effect, that until those 5 points are resolved, no version of this story, not the friend's account, not any theory circulating online, can honestly claim certainty about what happened to Nolan during that hour. But of those 5 questions, one deserves more attention than the rest, because of how the public has already treated it, not as an open question, as a settled fact. That question is the departure time, 4:31. It's been repeated in interviews, in reporting, in nearly every account of that day, until it started to sound less like an estimate and more like a fact. It isn't one. The Cajun Navy's own report says that time hasn't been confirmed through GPS, engine data, or any other electronic record. It's simply the time that's been repeated in interviews and reporting for weeks. But repetition isn't verification. As of this report, 4:31 is still, technically, an estimate, sourced from memory rather than a machine. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It probably isn't. Multiple people in that friend group have independently described a similar sequence of events. An independent, unrehearsed agreement is its own kind of evidence. But it does mean that one of the only fixed points in this entire timeline is softer than the public conversation around this case has been treating it. And if the departure time can't yet be nailed down to the minute, the question of exactly when, inside that hour-plus gap, Nolan was last actually seen, becomes even harder to answer with any real confidence. There's a temptation in a case like this to treat every inconsistency as suspicious, as if the truth would naturally arrive in one clean, matching story. People who work missing persons cases for a living will tell you the opposite is usually true. When nobody realizes at the time that they're a witness to something that will matter later, when there's no gunshot, no scream, no obvious signal that this ordinary afternoon needs to be remembered precisely, memories drift. Times shift by 20 or 30 minutes in either direction. 2 people who were standing 5 feet apart will describe the same 10 minutes differently, not because one of them is lying, but because neither of them was taking notes. Investigators who've spent careers on cases like this have said, in effect, that it would be more alarming if every account lined up perfectly than if they didn't. A little disagreement is what honest memory actually sounds like. There's another detail in these photos worth addressing directly, since it's already fueled plenty of online speculation on its own. Several people visible in the water and on the boats are holding drinks. It was a holiday. That, by itself, isn't remarkable, and it isn't evidence of anything beyond an ordinary 4th of July. But it is a legitimate reason investigators may weigh accounts differently depending on who gave them and when. Alcohol doesn't just affect judgment in the moment. It measurably affects how well people encode and later recall specific times and sequences of events, which matters when an entire case is being reconstructed around a single hour. That's not an accusation against anyone in these photos. It's context for why the report leans so heavily on physical evidence, timestamps, GPS, original files, instead of asking anyone to simply remember more carefully. If a detail like that changes how you're reading this case, that's kind of the point of laying it out this carefully. Drop a comment with what you think actually happened in that missing hour. I read them, and it's genuinely useful to see which parts of a report like this land differently for different people. That problem isn't limited to memory. It also runs straight through the video evidence everyone's already seen. Around the time the report says the boat was leaving, a video began circulating showing it with several people aboard, and Nolan not visibly among them. It's been treated by a lot of people online as close to confirmation, proof he really wasn't on that boat when it left. But the Cajun Navy's report raises a more basic problem before it'll accept that conclusion. A video pulled from social media isn't the same thing as a video file straight from a phone. Compression, cropping, re-uploads, and screen recordings can all strip out or alter the metadata that would otherwise tell you definitively when a clip was actually filmed. Without the original file, a video that looks like it was shot at 4:27 in the afternoon is really just a video that looks like it was shot around then. That's a meaningful difference in a case built entirely around minutes. It's a small, unglamorous point, and it's exactly the kind of detail an investigation actually lives or dies on. Anyone can screenshot a video and repost it with a caption claiming a time. Only the original file, with its metadata intact, can actually prove one. The report gives an even more direct example of how fragile a memory-based, screenshot-driven timeline can be. Several unverified claims circulated on social media in the days after Nolan disappeared, each one offering a slightly different account of where he was and when. One post described a witness who believed they'd seen someone matching Nolan's description, involved in a tense confrontation on the island sometime around 5 o'clock that evening. If true, it would have meant Nolan was still alive, and still in some kind of conflict, well after his friends say they'd already left. It's the kind of claim that could reshape the entire case. Within the same report, another person who says they were actually on that boat pushed back. According to them, the person in question wasn't Nolan at all. It was someone else entirely, in a different group, on a different vessel. The Cajun Navy didn't try to settle which account was right. It simply included both, side by side, and let the contradiction stand as its own kind of evidence. Proof that a single unverified claim, posted with total confidence, can shape how an entire case is understood for days, before anyone with first-hand knowledge gets the chance to correct it. Multiply that by every photo, every clip, every second-hand story that's circulated since July 4th, and you start to understand why 64 minutes has been so hard to nail down. It was never just about the evidence that exists. It's about how much of what people believe they know was never verified in the first place. One more distinction matters here, separating this report from the flood of other content that's grown up around this case. Amateur audio enhancements claiming to reveal words spoken in the background of emergency calls. Frame-by-frame video breakdowns insisting they've spotted something everyone else missed. Some of that content comes from people being transparent about its limits, labeling their own work as personal interpretation rather than confirmed fact. Some of it doesn't. This report sits apart from nearly all of it for one specific reason. It was built to be checked. Every image is sourced, and every claim about timing is qualified with exactly how confident the organization actually is in it. That's a low bar, and it says something uncomfortable about the rest of the information economy around this case that clearing it still makes this document stand out. There's a second puzzle buried in these same photographs, one that's gotten far less attention than the timeline gap, but that the report treats as just as significant. The boats themselves didn't stay still. Comparing images taken at different points in the afternoon, the report notes that at least one vessel, the one labeled Frontier Bay, isn't where it was in earlier photos by the time later ones were taken. That repositioning lines up, roughly, with a still frame pulled from the same disputed altercation video that circulated online for weeks. The one showing a heated confrontation that multiple people have said didn't involve Nolan at all. The report stops well short of connecting those two things directly. It simply notes that the timing and the movement happened to line up, and that nobody has yet established why that boat moved, where it went, or who was actually on board when it did. That kind of detail is easy to skim past, because on its own, it proves nothing. A boat repositioning during a crowded holiday afternoon could mean almost anything. Someone repositioning for better cell signal, moving away from a rowdy neighboring boat, simply drifting on an anchor that hadn't caught. Boats in that cove weren't parked. They were floating, loosely tied, in water that was actively pulling and pushing everything anchored in it, which is exactly why a photo taken at 3:40 and one taken at 4:15 can show a completely different arrangement without anything sinister happening in between. But in a case built on an hour that nobody can fully account for, even an explainable movement becomes one more thing that technically isn't explained yet. And it isn't the only boat worth asking about. The Triton itself, the boat Nolan arrived on, was already dealing with its own complication that afternoon. The mechanical trouble in water intake that friends have described as the reason for its early departure. 2 boats, 2 sets of movements, in the same tight window, and right now, only one of them has anyone publicly attached to explaining it. The report's recommendation here is the same one it makes throughout. Find out who was actually on that boat, and ask them, which raises the obvious next question. If nobody's done that yet for a boat with a name and a documented position change, how many boats in that wider cluster, the ones still just labeled with a number, haven't been asked about at all? Which brings us back to that photo. The cluster of boats, tied together, packed with people standing in water up to their chests. According to the Cajun Navy, some of the people in these images have already come forward on their own, recognizing their own boat in a photo that had gone public, and reaching out to say, essentially, that was us, here's what we saw. That kind of self-identification is already helping. But a report built entirely from what the public chose to send in has an obvious limit. It can only include the people who saw the photo, recognized themselves, and decided to speak up. It cannot account for the people who didn't. And on an island crowded with hundreds of boats on a holiday weekend, that's very likely not a small number. Every registered boat carries an identifying number, and in some cases a name, tied to an owner who can say who was aboard that day. Cross-referencing that registry against every unidentified boat in this report is, at least in theory, entirely possible. It just hasn't been done publicly, at least not yet. Which means that somewhere in that cluster of boats, in a photograph taken sometime in the late afternoon of July 4th, there may be people who watched the exact hour investigators are still trying to reconstruct, and who have never been asked a single question about it. Fair question, and worth asking plainly. Why did a volunteer hurricane response group end up doing this kind of detailed reconstruction at all, instead of the agencies actually running this investigation? The honest answer is that nobody outside the sheriff's department and the district attorney's office knows exactly what investigators have already gathered, cross-referenced, or ruled out, because none of it has been made public. That's not necessarily improper. Officials have said their restraint is meant to protect the investigation and the eventual grand jury process, not to hide anything. But it does leave a vacuum, and in a case this closely watched, that vacuum doesn't stay empty. It fills with theories, screenshots, and secondhand claims. The exact material this report was built specifically to sort through and, where possible, correct. That's the real function this document is serving right now. Not as a substitute for the official investigation, but as a stopgap, built by people with boats and free time and no subpoena power, doing the closest thing the public has seen yet to an actual accounting of who was where and when. If any of this describes you, if you were anywhere near that cluster of boats on July 4th, and you've just been going about your life since, the right move isn't a comment section. It's reaching out to the Cajun Navy directly, or to Jackson County investigators. Both have public tip channels for exactly this. For the rest of us watching from the outside, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because if a name ever gets attached to one of those boats, this is where you'll hear it first. None of this exists in a vacuum. For weeks, the explanation for Nolan's disappearance has rested almost entirely on the accounts of the friends who traveled with him. That he chose to stay behind on the island, planning to catch another ride home later. That account hasn't been proven false, but it was also never something investigators verified independently before it became the version most people accepted as fact. This report doesn't challenge that account directly. It does something quieter, and in some ways, more damaging to easy certainty. It shows how much of the timeline surrounding that account still hasn't been checked against anything except what people remember. That same pattern, real information sitting right next to a wall of things nobody's confirmed, runs through every part of this case right now. Nolan's family commissioned their own autopsy, separate from the state's. Its conclusion, cause and manner of death, undetermined. Not because the pathologist found nothing worth noting, because critical tissue had already been removed during the state's own exam, before an independent expert ever got the chance to look. Mississippi's official autopsy is finished. It's been finished for over a week. It's still sealed, withheld until it can be presented to a grand jury, a process the district attorney has said isn't unusual for her county and isn't designed to hide anything. Toxicology results haven't been released either. So overlay the two timelines. On one side, a 64-minute window on July 4th that nobody's fully accounted for. On the other, a full month afterward, where the single piece of evidence most likely to explain what actually happened to Nolan, an official cause of death, still hasn't reached the public. Two different kinds of waiting. Both are keeping this case exactly where it's been for weeks, unresolved, unproven, and impossible to close. And that unresolved space has already had consequences that have nothing to do with what actually happened to Nolan. In the weeks since his disappearance, multiple people connected to this case, simply for being present that day, or for speaking publicly about it, have had to report threats serious enough to result in criminal charges, including at least one federal case. None of those charges relate to Nolan's death itself. They relate to what people did to each other while trying to decide, from a screen, who deserved blame for it. Keep that in mind with a report like this one. A boat number isn't a name. A cluster of people in a photograph isn't a list of suspects. It's a list of potential witnesses, nothing more. And treating it as anything else is exactly the kind of leap this report goes out of its way not to make. The people in that photo, whoever they turn out to be, weren't put there to be accused of anything. They were just at the beach. So here's where this actually stands, stripped down to what's confirmed. Nolan Wells was last independently placed on Horn Island at 3:23 in the afternoon on July 4th. The boat he arrived on reportedly left without him at 4:31, though that exact time still hasn't been verified electronically. His body was recovered 2 days later. The state autopsy is complete and sealed, pending a grand jury. The family's independent autopsy could not determine a cause or manner of death. Toxicology hasn't been released. And this week, a 22-page report built entirely from public submissions confirmed what investigators have never said out loud. A real, unaccounted-for gap exists in the hour after Nolan was last seen, and the tools that could close it, verified video, phone data, a complete list of who was actually there, still haven't been fully gathered. Unconfirmed and still wide open. Who else was in that cluster of boats? What any of them saw? Whether the 64 minutes at the center of this report holds an explanation, or simply more silence. No charges have been filed in Nolan's death. No agency has said, publicly, that a crime took place. What exists, a month later, is a report built by volunteers doing the kind of legwork an overwhelmed, understandably tight-lipped investigation hadn't finished in public, handed directly to the people who can actually use it, and a photograph of a crowd that might still hold the one answer nobody's asked for yet. The report's authors have said they're not trying to replace the work investigators are doing. They're trying to make sure it doesn't have to start from zero. Every photo, every GPS coordinate, every boat identification in these 22 pages is now sitting with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the district attorney, and Nolan's parents, ready to be used, verified, or discarded as the actual investigation sees fit. Whether it moves the case forward is no longer up to the volunteers who built it. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. Whatever that hour eventually explains, the people trying hardest to account for it right now aren't investigators with subpoena power. They're strangers who were in the water that day, deciding, one photo at a time, to stop staying quiet. Cases like this one are rarely cracked by a single dramatic discovery. More often, they move forward because someone scrolling past a photo online recognizes their own boat in the background, or remembers a detail they didn't think mattered until they saw it framed a different way. That's what this report actually is, an invitation for that moment to happen again, for whoever hasn't had it yet. If you were on Horn Island on July 4th, and you're only now realizing what you saw might matter, the case isn't closed, and neither is the window to come forward. When that grand jury convenes, when the missing minutes finally get an explanation instead of a photograph, we'll be here for it. Until then, the questions stay open. So does this case.